Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Rayi Ghalib Panut. Here I will present about a theoretical approach to literature, as with the classification system of genre and text types. The approach to literary texts are characterized by a number of divergent methodologies. The following sections show that literary interpretation always reflects a particular intuitional, cultural, and historical background. The various trends in textual studies are represented either by consecutive school or parallel ones, which at times compete with each other. On the one hand, the various scholarly approach to literary texts partly overlap. On the other, they differ in their theoretical foundation. Because this is a follow-up material from the discussion by the previous group regarding the four main approaches in theoretical approach to literature. So in this discussion, we will only discuss the last 2 points of the theoretical approach to literature, namely reader-oriented approach and context-oriented approach. Reader-oriented approach developed in the 1960s called reception theory, reader-response theory, or aesthetic of reception. Reception theory is obviously opposed to a new criticism dogma of affective fallacy, which demand an interpretation free of subjective contribution by reader. This approach assumes that a text creates certain expectation in the reader in every pass or of reading. These expectations are then either fulfilled or left fulfilled. Edgar Allan Poe's The Murders in the Rue Morgue is one of the examples of this approach. It guides readers' imagination and expectation in different directions. Three main terms in reader-oriented approach. First, reception theory. Reception theory is obviously opposed to next criticism dogma of affective fallacy, which demand an interpretation free of subjective contribution by the reader. Reader-centered approach examine the readership of the text and investigate why, where, and when it is read. They also examine certain reading practice of social, ethnic, or national group. They aim at revealing certain mechanisms which are employed in the transformation of the visual sign on paper into a coherent, meaningful text in the mind of the reader. Reception history. A further aspect which is closely connected with this movement is the investigation of the reception of text by particular readership. In reception history, sales figures are examined together with reviews in newspaper and magazine. Reader-response criticism. Reader-response criticism emphasizes the reader as much as the text. It seeks to understand how a given reader comes together with a given literary work to produce a unique reading. Context-oriented approach. This term refers to heterogeneous group of school and methodology which do not regard literary texts as self-contained, independent work of art but try to place them within a large context. It is divided into two parts. They are literary history and Marxist literary theory. Marxist literary theory is based on the writing of Karl Marx. It examines the condition of production in certain literary periods and their influence on the literary texts of the times. Type of context-oriented approach. First, new historicism. One of the latest developments in the field of contextual approach has been new historicism, which arose in the US in the 1980s. It builds on post-structuralism and deconstruction, with their focus on text and discourse, but adds a historical dimension to the discussion of literary text. Typical questions involved in historical criticism include the following: how accurately does the work reflect the historical period in which it was written? What specific historical event influenced the author? How important is the work historical context to the understanding it? How does the work represent an interpretation of its time and culture? New historicism. Feminist literary theory and gender theory. The most productive and at the same time most revolutionary movement of the younger theory of literary criticism in general and the contextual approach in particular is feminist literary theory. Feminist literary theory born on the movement of people, especially women, which has strongly established academic discipline. Feminist literary theory starts with the assumption that gender difference is an aspect which has been neglected in traditional literary criticism and therefore argue that traditional domain literary criticism have to be re-examined from a gender-oriented perspective. Typical questions involved in this approach include the following: how does the work portray the life of women? How are female characters portrayed? How are the relationships between men and women portrayed? Does this reinforce sexual and gender stereotypes or challenge them? How does the specific language of a literary work reflect gender or sexual stereotypes? That's all from me. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.